The first thing the hunters smelled was iron, not dirt nor pine, nor the dust of winter leaves, but iron, hot and wet, as though the forest itself had been cut open and allowed to bleed. The dogs froze in their tracks. None barked. Not a leaf moved. And then, from between two ancient sycamores, 3 figures stepped into view, moving not like children, but like exhausted elders who had crawled up from graves. Bare feet, mud caked to their chests, hair matted in ropes that hung like weeds torn from a river mouth. Their faces were blank, their eyes half open, as though they had seen too much. The smallest of the 3 carried something, a leather pouch, swollen and dark. It seemed splitting. Inside, a wet slither of bone fragments clicked. 8 years missing. 8 years swallowed by the Ozark woods. And now, without a single word, they simply emerged. The hunters tried to speak, but found their voices caught. The silence between the children and the adults was so absolute that it felt forbidden to break. One hunter, the oldest, swore later that the air around them felt thick, like standing in the last breath of a dying man. When the smallest child lifted their head, the hunters finally understood what had happened to them. Their eyes were black, not dark, not shadowed, black, like 2 pooled wells of ink. They whispered, in one voice though their 3 mouths barely moved, "He is coming." The words slid through the men like ghostly knives. One collapsed to his knees, another retched bile into the soil. The last staggered backwards as though struck. And then the children spoke again, this time with unmistakable certainty. "He wants the rest of us. Before I go on, tell me something. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because this story, this quiet excavation of a family that should never have existed, begins long before those children stumbled from the trees, long before anyone dared to whisper their surname, long before the Ozarks became a place marked on maps as though its edges could be tamed by ink. The land here is older than the nation that claimed it, older than the treaties and wars that carved it. Beneath the rolling hills and limestone caves lie records that never made it into official archives. Stories passed only in the mutterings of dying elders, in journals written by candlelight, in the unblessed murmur of church basements. The people who settled here believed the woods were a mouth, a living mouth, that fed not on flesh, but lineage, bloodlines, names, memory, and what was taken 8 years ago was not 3 children. It was a legacy the Ozarks had been nursing for a century. They would later say the children smelled like the caves, that damp mineral scent, like stone dust mixed with marrow. They would say the forest behind them felt like a doorway left open. But no one in town knew how to speak about what had returned. They only knew where the story started. Long before any of them were born, in the settlement that became known as Hollis Hollow. It was not a town in the usual sense. No marked boundary, no official founding date. It gathered itself like fungus, appearing as cabins scattered along ravines, built by families with names the government never cared to write. Their records were kept in Bibles with waterlogged pages, passed between kin, stained with smoke and rain. No one new arrived, no one left unless they were carried out. Around 1892, a midwife named Etta Rowan began recording the births there. Her script was rough, uneven, as though written during tremors. She wrote of frail infants born too quiet, of women who labored for days and emerged hollow-eyed, never speaking again. She wrote of children whose bones grew strangely, whose legs bowed and arms twisted, whose voices sounded older than their throats. She wrote of one peculiar pattern: twins, triplets, quadruplets, births that came in clusters, as if the land demanded multiples, and many of them, when still toddlers, would wander from their cabins to sit among the stones near the caves, humming songs no one recognized. When asked, they said they were listening to the deep voice. Some elders claimed there were caverns beneath the hollow, so vast they swallowed sound. Others believed the caves were wounds in the land, places where something ancient bled through. By 1910, nearly every remaining family shared blood, marriages braided within the same surname. Great-aunts became wives. Cousins became mothers. Men fathered children they also called nephews. It was done quietly, without shame, as though following instructions no outsider could see. Ita's last journal pages, the ones found sealed in wax, mentioned drawings carved inside the caves, spirals of interlocked limbs and faces, merging until one could not tell where one person ended and another began. She wrote a sentence that historians stumbled over. They do not see incest the way we do. They see roots, not branches. The hollow grew smaller through the decades, as sickness thinned the lines and drought starved the soil. Yet what remained became tighter, more intertwined, as though the families sensed extinction approaching and clung to one another, not out of love, but compulsion. And from that dwindling root, in a cabin built of damp oak and soft clay, the family that would one day produce the vanished triplets began its slow descent. The cabin stood on a slope where the soil sank like a bruise. Its windows had never seen glass. Its roof had never known shingles. The boards, swollen from decades of humidity, pressed against each other like swollen flesh. The family who lived there did not think of themselves as cursed, nor blessed. They simply believed they had been given a role, one shaped before they were born. The first child of that modern line was born in 1948, a boy named Silas Rowan. He came out silent, eyes open, staring, as if he recognized the midwife. He did not cry, but he breathed with conviction, as though he had chosen to be here rather than forced. For years, neighbors whispered that he walked with purpose, even before he learned to run. That when he sat by the caves, he never hummed like the others. He listened, perfectly motionless, as if receiving instruction. Silas grew tall but lean, his bones seeming almost too long, as though his frame was being stretched towards something unseen. He married young, but not by chance. The girl's surname was also Rowan, though the kinship was not discussed openly. The families had braided themselves so thoroughly over generations that no clear line remained. Blood recognized blood, and that seemed enough. The first child of Silas and his wife died at birth. The second lived for 3 days, and then slipped into silence. The third was carried into the forest, where old women with prayer, broken lips chanted around the infant, until the child's eyes turned upward and locked onto cracks in the earth above. The fourth child lived. Her name was Morella. She looked older than she should, staring at visitors with eyes that betrayed no youth. She spoke sparingly, choosing words that unsettled adults. When she was 4, she said to her father, "You did not grow in her womb. You were shaped before her bones." Silas did not strike her. He did not rebuke her. He only nodded, as though she had spoken a truth he had long suspected. 3 years later, she vanished. The family searched for her, but not frantically. More like people following ritual rather than instinct. They walked the boundaries of the woods, stopping where stones protruded like vertebrae from the land. They left offerings, cloth, seeds, teeth from long, dead goats. They never screamed her name, because in the hollow, calling into the woods was believed to summon old replies. A season passed. A year. Morella returned. She stood in the cabin doorway one dawn, muddy and barefoot, her hair tangled in vines. She looked no older, but her voice was different, deeper, resonant, like soil shifting beneath rock. And she said only one thing. "He is waiting for the third time." The return of Morella changed everything. Her parents spoke in low murmurs, as if the words themselves might draw attention. The forest seemed to lean closer to the cabin, its branches bending in unnatural angles, casting shadows like fingers reaching for the walls. At night, the family could hear something moving under the floorboards. Not rats, not wind. Something deliberate. Something that knew their names. Morella began to draw. Not on paper, but on walls, on stones, on the bare floor. Spirals and knots, faces folding into other faces. Limbs overlapping until one could no longer tell where one ended and another began. The villagers who glimpsed her sketches said they felt nausea, vertigo, as if staring into a mirror that reflected not their bodies, but their sins. Soon, the animals around the cabin began dying. Chickens collapsed mid-step, their throats ripped from within. The family dog vanished, leaving only tracks that ended at the edge of the forest, turning back on themselves in impossible loops. Neighbors whispered that the forest was hungry, but they said it quietly, glancing over shoulders, afraid to wake whatever Morella had carried back with her. At night, screams echoed. Sometimes they were hers. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes they came from the floorboards, sometimes from the forest, sometimes from the attic, where the wind never reached, but the shadows always congregated. Morella's voice would join them, chanting words no one recognized, syllables that scraped at the tongue like broken glass. The family attempted to contain her. They tied her wrists with strips of linen, fed her bread and water, pressed her into the earth outside to keep her close. But her eyes never left the trees. She watched them breathe, as if counting seconds, listening for something deeper, older. She spoke only once in their presence. "The third is ready. We have all been waiting." By the following winter, the siblings were born. Twins, a boy and a girl, both pale as the underbelly of a snake. From the moment they drew breath, they exhibited the same unsettling awareness Morella had shown. They did not play like children. They studied. They observed. Their tiny hands traced the spirals Morella had drawn on the walls. At night, they whispered to each other in voices that belonged to no human language. Voices that made the house tremble. The forest itself seemed to recognize them. Trees groaned as if speaking. Stones shifted beneath the snow. Windows rattled without wind. And when the family tried to leave, the paths folded back into themselves, turning the forest into an impossible labyrinth. It was not long before the parents understood the truth that had been buried for generations. The patterns of their lineage, the incest, the endless folding of family into family, had not ended. It had merely slept, waiting for this next iteration. And now, with Morella returned and the twins alive, the forest, the blood, and the bones were ready to speak again. The forest no longer concealed its presence. It pressed against the cabin, as though curious, patient, and hungry. By midsummer, the children, Morella and the twins, began disappearing for hours, sometimes entire days. They returned with mud caked deep into their hair, their fingernails streaked with black earth, and their eyes reflecting something that was not quite human. Neighbors began to notice that the air around the hollow carried a faint metallic tang, like blood left to rust. Dogs would howl at the forest's edge, then fall silent, collapsed as if the scent had drained their strength. Livestock began to vanish, leaving behind only footprints that led into impossible hollows in the woods. The hollow itself seemed to shift, the hills softening in places, valleys deepening, trees leaning with intent. The town elders muttered that the land was alive, in a way no one could control, and it fed on the family's decay. The twins began to speak in whispers only Morella could understand. At night, they would gather bones, sometimes animal, sometimes human, fragments they could not name, and arrange them in spirals and towers across the cabin floor. When Morella traced her fingers over their arrangements, she would hum, a low note that seemed to make the walls pulse with life. One evening, Silas's wife fell asleep by the hearth and awoke to a vision of the attic floor lifting, as if the cabin itself inhaled. Morella and the twins were suspended in darkness, their eyes blackened pools. They murmured names she did not recognize, names that belonged to generations folded into themselves, names that should have been forgotten but had grown roots deep in the soil. The truth became undeniable. The family was bound by more than blood. The forest had chosen them to continue its lineage of madness, its cycles of hunger, its communion with the deep voice. Morella and the twins were no longer children. They were conduits, vessels shaped by centuries of incest, ritual, and decay. One night, Silas followed them into the woods, hoping to reclaim control, but found only spirals carved into moss, symbols that made his stomach twist, and a faint smell of iron on the wind. They led him to a clearing where the earth was disturbed, soft as if freshly turned, and in its center lay a pit. Within it, shadows moved with intent. The children did not speak, yet Silas understood. The pit had been waiting for them, for the next generation. And for the first time, he saw what the forest demanded: continuation, no matter the cost. By dawn, the house reeked of smoke and wet soil. The neighbors found Silas and his wife kneeling by the front porch, hands pressed together as though in prayer, eyes vacant. Morella and the twins had vanished once again, their footprints swallowed by the woods, leaving only silence, broken occasionally by whispers carried on the wind. The hollow had claimed them, or perhaps they had always been part of the hollow, and the town, already wary, began to speak of fire, of erasing the records, of severing the roots. But some things, once grown in darkness, do not die quietly. The town's response was slow, measured by fear and generations of whispered caution. By the next week, a handful of men arrived at the cabin with torches and hatchets, faces pale, hands trembling. They were not strangers. They were neighbors who had known the family for decades, whose grandfathers had spoken of the Rowan line as something to observe from afar. But tonight, they would act. The cabin burned. Flames licked the walls and roof, consuming boards swollen with decades of moisture, twisting them into shrieking splinters. The fire stank of clay and pine, of old blood, of something that had rooted itself too deeply in the land. From inside, the smell of iron and smoke rose with a sharpness that made the men gag. Some swore they heard laughter, childlike, echoing, impossibly close, even as the house collapsed into ash. In the aftermath, the men dug through the ruins, seeking the scattered remains of the family. The twins were gone, as was Morella. Silas and his wife were nowhere to be found. Only fragments remained: charred cloth, splintered beams, and a few scorched bones, which were quickly buried far from prying eyes. The town's church became involved, though quietly. The pastor led a procession to sanctify the ground, to pray for the souls that had never known peace. Church members scoured old records, attempting to sever the tangled genealogies, erasing names and marriages from Bibles and ledgers. Some nights they reported strange noises outside the church walls, low, guttural chants the scraping of nails on stone, footsteps circling the building in impossible rhythms. Families who had once intermarried with the Rowans began to vanish from the hollow's edges. Farms went fallow, barns collapsed, wells dried. The land seemed to recoil from the memory of what had occurred, as if it were purging itself. Those who survived told tales of shadows moving along the tree line, figures that were too long-limbed, eyes too dark. Watching silently as if waiting for the town to falter, historians and genealogists would later struggle to reconstruct the Rowan lineage. Photographs, letters, and baptismal records had been destroyed or altered. Old tapes recorded by visiting researchers captured only faint, distorted murmurs, voices layered atop one another, speaking in a cadence that sounded almost like song. One tape, recorded in the 1980s, contained a sequence of whispers repeating, "Roots fold in on themselves. Blood does not lie. They will return." The town, collectively, tried to move on, but the hollow was no longer just a place. It had become a presence, a cautionary memory that seeped into every home nearby. Families spoke in hushed tones of children born with strange habits, of animals that disappeared, of glimpses of figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching through the fog. And somewhere, far in the shadowed caverns of the forest, Morella and the twins waited, shaping themselves into something older than the town, something older than the land itself. The legacy of the Rowans had not ended. It had only paused, biding its time. By the 1980s, the story of the Rowans had faded from living memory, reduced to a few whispered legends, half forgotten by the town's younger generation. But the hollow does not forget, and some curiosity, even decades later, is a dangerous thing. A researcher named Thomas Keane arrived, drawn by a reference buried in a genealogy archive in Little Rock. He was meticulous, patient, and skeptical, the kind of man who believed in facts, in dates, in documents. What he found in the hollow, however, defied records. The burned cabin site was just a clearing now, but beneath the earth, pressed into the damp soil, were fragments of bone too small to belong to any one person, and spirals carved deep into the clay, worn smooth with age. Keane discovered letters hidden within a hollowed tree. They were written by the old midwife, Etta Rowan. Her script trembling with fear and devotion, she detailed births, deaths, disappearances, and, most disturbingly, rituals performed by the family. She had referred to Morella by name, predicting her disappearance and return. She wrote of the twins, describing them as conduits, vessels shaped by generations of interwoven bloodlines. The deeper Keane dug, the more he felt the weight of the hollow itself pressing against him. Footprints appeared in the mud that led nowhere. Tools he left in his cabin at night were moved, arranged into patterns he could not explain. At times, he would hear whispers beneath the floorboards, whispers in a language he could not translate, rhythms that echoed the spirals drawn on the walls. One evening, while reviewing tapes from a forgotten local historian, he caught voices repeating over and over, "They return. Roots fold in on themselves. Blood does not lie." Keane realized the magnitude of what he had stumbled upon. This was not merely a family's descent into madness, it was a generational spiral, a continuum of ritual, secrecy, and blood that refused to be broken. The Rowans had woven themselves into the land, the trees, the stones, and the caves. Each child born, each ritual performed, each disappearance was a stitch in a fabric older than the town itself. He documented everything carefully, yet even his meticulous notes could not capture the full horror. The hollow had its own memory, one that seeped into those who tried to record it, leaving them haunted, sleepless, and at times, unable to distinguish their own voices from those buried beneath the roots. Keen left the hollow with a warning buried in his journals. Some histories are not meant to be unearthed. Some families are not meant to be understood. And some forests do not allow their secrets to die. The hollow did not forget. Even decades later, locals claimed to see figures moving among the trees at dusk. Small shapes with elongated limbs. Faces too pale, eyes too dark. They moved in silence, or perhaps in whispers too soft for human ears. The land had absorbed Morella, the twins, and the generations before them, folding them into the roots and stones, into the scent of iron that always lingered after rain. Keen's journals, though carefully hidden in the archives of a small university, contained warnings too subtle for most to heed. He described nights spent tracing the patterns in the woods, listening to whispers in the wind, feeling a presence that seemed to observe and judge him. In his final entries, he wrote of the unmistakable feeling that the children, Morella and the twins, were never truly gone. That they existed both in the woods and in memory, ready to emerge whenever the lineage demanded it. Some of the townspeople who had survived the destruction of the Rowan cabin recounted dreams in which the children returned. They spoke of being watched as they slept, of hearing the low hum of spirals, of waking to footprints in the dust that had not been there before. No one dared approach the hollow after dark, and yet, no one could entirely avoid its shadow. The forest called, and it was patient. The lineage of the Rowans, twisted by generations of incest and ritual, had left more than a story. It left a presence, a pattern that could not be erased. DNA, blood, and memory intertwined, creating conduits through which the forest spoke. Morella and the twins were not children in the conventional sense. They were vessels, inheritors of a secret older than the town, older than the maps, older than recorded history. And so the hollow waits. For those who dare, it whispers promises and threats alike. For the curious, it tests patience. For those who would try to sever its lineage, it punishes with silence, absence, and the creeping weight of roots. Generations of fear, secrecy, and ritual converge there, and anyone who steps too close risks being folded into the pattern. Because in Hollis Hollow, nothing truly disappears. Bones may crumble, cabins may burn, records may vanish. But the cycle endures. And in the deepest shadows, Morella and the twins are still listening, still watching, still waiting for the next fold in the bloodline to awaken the forest's ancient hunger. What would you do if you discovered the person you loved most was also the one you were forbidden to know? End.